Right.
Colin,
Yeah.
when we spoke all those years ago when you got the position,
Yeah.
as head of the BOA, you mentioned that you were steadfastly behind the bylaw
Yeah.
then. So today's decision by the CAS then must come as a blow to you. What were your personal thoughts?
Yeah, I was very sad for the IFC. I think they've fought hard against doping in sport. They got this rule in place to stop an athlete who's had a minimum 6-month sentence during the 4 years from going to the next games. And I know Jack Rogge, as the president, has worked incessantly hard to try and eradicate doping from sport. He'll be disappointed. The IOC will be disappointed. And I share that disappointment with them.
You made a clear distinction earlier between sanctions and eligibility. Would you argue the two were tantamount to the same thing, though?
No, I'd say they weren't. And actually what's interesting is the World Anti-Doping Agency says they aren't. What we do is we select the team. So we have the job to manage, to lead, and to select the team. When you select a team, you set criteria. And those are eligibility criteria. And one of those criteria is that serious doping offences don't make you eligible for selection for the team. That's very different from a sanction. Yeah. And that was the issue at stake in Lausanne. Rule 45 was seen as a second sanction, a second penalty. And that's very different from the eligibility criteria.
In terms of the eligibility criteria, you mentioned that, should someone fall foul of the doping rules, there were mitigating circumstances that would be looked at. Does admission of guilt in the way that David Miller kind of has tried to reform and help other athletes try to dissuade them, does that constitute mitigating circumstances for you?
Well, it doesn't, sadly. David Miller is a great athlete. Yeah. What David Miller performed as part of the team that got the Cavendish the gold in Copenhagen the other day was a remarkable achievement. But he made a decision. He knew he'd been to the games. He knew there was an eligibility bylaw. He knew if you stepped over the mark and you took a cocktail of drugs and you were done for EPO, that would mean you would not be eligible for future teams. He fully understood that.
I mean, the reason I asked, Colin, is because at present there's no distinction and no difference between the athlete who gets caught and stays stum and the athlete who does what David did, what David is doing. Do you understand the position I'm coming from?
I absolutely understand the position, but what's interesting is that the eligibility bylaw has stayed in place, and yet David has found it in him to really be a reformed character and to help and to make sure that the next generation don't fall foul of what he did. He fully accepts and recognises that what he did meant that he was not going to be eligible for the British team, but that didn't stop him really helping out the next generation and joining the fight against doping.
Does the bylaw as it stands incentivise athletes to come forward?
I think the bylaw as it stands brings home to all athletes of all ages that if you ever get into serious doping to enhance your performance and cheat other athletes of a place in the team, you will not be selected. So I think a lot of them think that is a deterrent. No way am I going down that road, because the consequences of that mean I'll never compete for Team GB in the future. And I think that deterrent is really
It's a little bit like capital. Sorry to interrupt. It's a little bit like capital punishment, though. Does it actually work? Does it stop the drug cheat from cheating?
Well, you're not going to. Yeah, of course I do, and it's a legitimate question. But I think it is a deterrent, and I think that the fact that we have relatively few, thank heavens, individuals who do dope cheat their fellow teammates shows that the deterrent works by comparison to a number of other countries.
My last question then is, you say that the BOA works closely with athletes to establish the position and strengthen your position. What other alternatives have been suggested by these athletes who are canvassed every Olympic Games, as was said earlier, in order to maybe move away from the bylaw and implement something that's not as draconian in some people's opinion?
I know you love sport, and I know you'll be the first to say that I'm really pleased that since we first met when I became chairman of the BOA, we've now got an athletes commission in the BOA with some of the top athletes in the country who are involved in everyday activity, all our policy making and everyday activity. And they say we need to have good education programs on drugs. We need to make sure that young athletes know exactly the consequences of what happens. And they say that we need to have tough sanctions. And they say that we need an eligibility bylaw as well. It's the athletes speaking. And 20 years ago, it was 95% saying that we need to keep the eligibility bylaw. 20 years on, next year is 20 years, we're 19 now, the same athletes, but a new generation of athletes as well, are joined together in making sure you got tough eligibility.
And we're seeing how those questions are worded to the athletes. I mean, because that's the only way
we'll make that public. I mean, I'm very happy to have, leave that with you. Fantastic. But, you know, it's basically, do you believe that the bylaw should be kept in place? And well over 90%, winter games as well as summer games, turn around and say, yes, please.
Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.